The torches sputtered in the winter wind, their flames coughing out embers that drifted like dying fireflies into the black. Somewhere in the depths of the palace, a bell tolled midnight, its echo swallowed by thick walls that had heard centuries of whispers, confessions, plots, prayers, and the kind of bargains made only in desperation. You could smell it before you saw it, that strange, heavy sweetness, not perfume, not incense. It was the smell of something warm once, now long stilled, coaxed back into the realm of the living through mortar and pestle. A servant in a tattered livery knelt at the far end of the chamber, hands trembling as he ground the mixture. His knuckles were pale, his lips moving in silent prayer, though whether he prayed for the soul of the dead or his own safety was hard to tell. The powder in his mortar caught the light, a dull earthen brown with flecks the color of bone. When he tipped the bowl, it slid like sand into a silver goblet of red wine. The man who would drink it waited in silence. His robe shimmered like molten gold under candlelight, his signet ring catching the glow. He was pale, and the fever in his eyes had dulled nothing of his will. In this moment he was not a king, not a prince, not a man. He was hunger wearing a crown. You see, in the courts of Europe, there was a time when the body itself was a commodity. Flesh, blood, and bone could be turned into remedies for the rich and powerful. And in this world, the most esteemed medicine was born from the most unsettling truth. To live, they would consume the dead.
It was the year 1670, the reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King. Versailles glittered like a jewel set against the winter sky, mirrored halls, chandeliers dripping crystal, silk carpets soft enough to muffle treacherous footsteps. The air carried the faint sting of perfume over sweat, powder over rot, luxury pressed against decay like a fresh rose pinned to a corpse. In the king's private study, the atmosphere shifted. Here the sweetness was sharper, almost metallic, and it came from the small casket resting on a desk of polished walnut. Inside, nestled in folds of crimson velvet, lay the prized poudre de momie. This mummy powder was not metaphor. It was ground from the flesh of embalmed bodies, harvested from the tombs of Egypt, traded through Venetian merchants, and sold at a price worth a minor estate. The royal physician, a man who had trained his hands to move without trembling, opened the parchment. The powder shimmered faintly in the candlelight, as if the desert sun still clung to it. He tipped a pinch into a goblet of claret wine, the dark grains swirling into the liquid like smoke under water. The smell rose, dust of old crypts, a ghost of resin, and beneath it, the coppery whisper of once living flesh. Louis XIV lifted the cup without hesitation. It was said this powder could cure headaches, ease internal bleeding, even strengthen the heart. For the king, it was less about belief than certainty. He was the state, and the state could not fall ill. He drank, jaw set, teeth gritting against the grit that scraped across his tongue. In the corner, the physician's mind flickered to the last shipment. Not all of it came from Egypt. One parcel, he knew, had been fresh, a criminal taken from the gallows, dried over slow heat until the flesh could be scraped, powdered, and sealed in waxed paper. It was the stronger kind. The king had praised it. And so, in the palace of mirrors, where every surface reflected glory, no one spoke aloud of the truth, that the Sun King's brilliance was, in part, fed by the shadows of the dead.
In the year 1612, the winter in London was iron cold. The Thames had crusted over with ice so thick that merchants set up stalls on its frozen back selling hot wine, sweetmeats, and charms against the plague.
The city's breath rose in clouds against a sky the color of tarnished silver, and somewhere beyond the stink of fishmongers and dung-slick alleys stood Whitehall Palace, where the cold did not dare to bite so deeply. Inside, the Queen's chambers were kept warm with a forest of candles and braziers that glowed like captured suns. Thick velvet curtains sealed the room from the draft, and the air was heavy perfumed, yes, but beneath the lavender and rosewater was something sharper, iron on the tongue, the faintest trace of something living or freshly dead. Queen Anne of Denmark, wife of King James I, lay pale upon her pillows, her lips chapped, her pulse fluttering like a caged bird's wing. Fever had held her for 3 days, and the court physicians, robed in black with ruffs starched like halos, moved about her bed in a silent, deliberate dance. They had tried the standard cures, purging, bleeding, herbal infusions, but the fever clung stubbornly. So they turned to the medicine kept for moments when hope faltered. A page entered carrying a small pewter flagon wrapped in cloth to keep it warm. The lid was lifted, and the smell rose thick, sweet, metallic. This was the king's blood, drawn fresh that morning, not from his veins, but from the veins of a freshly executed young man, hanged at Tyburn just at dawn. His body had been carted swiftly to the palace's back entrance, where the executioner's knife opened him before the warmth had left. The blood had been whisked into the kitchens, stirred over a low fire with powdered amber, crushed pearls, and cinnamon until it thickened. It was said that the vitality of the young man, his life violently snatched, still lingered in the blood, ready to be taken into another's body, like one candle lighting another. The queen did not resist as the cup was placed at her lips. Her eyes, glassy with fever, did not seem to see the crimson liquid. The court ladies looked away, not from disgust, but because to witness this act was to be complicit. The taste was rich and cloying, the warmth sliding down her throat like a living thing. Somewhere deep inside, the fever flinched. The king stood at the foot of the bed, his hands clasped, his gaze steady. To save his queen, the life of a nameless man had been poured into her veins, one swallow at a time. In that candlelit chamber, royalty and death were joined in a pact older than any throne, a belief that the vitality of one body could be stolen, harnessed, made to serve another. Outside, the city carried on, oblivious. Children played on the ice, merchants shouted their wares, and the wind off the river carried no whisper of the fact that in the palace, the line between life and death had been drunk away in a single cup. By the mid-17th century, what had once been whispered as a desperate remedy began to slip into the gilded rituals of European courts. It was no longer the scandalous secret of a fevered queen or the hidden indulgence of an aging prince. It was a prescription written in the language of ceremony, cloaked in incense, silverware, and the sound of viols playing in the background. In Paris, the court of Louis XIV sparkled under the chandelier light, but behind the walls hung heavy with gold brocade, the appetite for mumia, the powdered remains of embalmed corpses, was as refined as the taste for rare wines. Apothecaries moved in the shadow of the Louvre, their jars lined like soldiers, each labeled in fine script, Mumia vera Egyptiaca, Crania humanum, Pulvis cordis. These were not for the sick in the gutter. These were for dukes, cardinals, and queens. The king himself was not above the practice. Louis, the sun, believed his radiance was divinely ordained, and if the sun must never set, then his flesh must never fail. The physicians of his court brought forth tiny silver boxes inlaid with ivory. Inside, resting on silk, were thin wafers of candied human heart, taken from the young, the strong, the executed. Each piece had been soaked in wine, dried in honey, and dusted with gold leaf, until it looked like some exotic confection fit for Versailles. These delicacies were served not at the table, but in private. A trusted valet would bring them on a tray, and the king, between audiences, might take one, as a man might take a sugared almond. To the courtiers, it was medicine. To the king, it was insurance. It was said that the heart carried not only courage, but the essence of youth, and to eat it was to swallow another springtime. But the true horror was not the act, it was the pageantry. The same hands that poured him claret also held the vessel that had once been a living heart. The same gilded rooms that echoed with minuets and poetry also smelled faintly, if one stood close enough, of resin and dried blood. The musicians played, the courtiers bowed, the king smiled. And somewhere in Paris, a family still mourned the son who had been donated for the health of the crown. It was not confined to France. In the German states, in the court of Frederick I of Prussia, the powdered skull of a man who had died violently was kept in a glass vial at the bedside. The king's physician swore that when dissolved in wine, it drove away the vapors of the mind and strengthened the spirit. The drinking of it was done in silence, as though even in a palace that tolerated so much, this was a line no voice dared to cross aloud. And yet, each act of consumption was framed as devotion to the body politic. A king must live for the realm, they said, and so if a few nameless lives were folded into his bread, his wine, his sugared fruits, was that not a noble sacrifice? The logic was as smooth as the marble floors of their halls, and as cold. By then, cannibalism was no longer the hidden edge of medicine. It was a quiet rhythm in the heartbeat of power. And like all rhythms, once begun, it was hard to stop.
By the early 18th century, the practice had slipped from the private chambers of kings into the streets and market squares. What began as a courtly indulgence was now a ritual that reached the common hand, though not with the same refinement. In the shadow of church towers, apothecaries displayed their wares in plain sight: brown jars filled with powdered bone, strips of dried human flesh wrapped in paper, and small phials containing thick, rust-colored oils pressed from skulls. The smell was faint but metallic, like the breath of a blacksmith's forge. In London, the most coveted source of medicinal flesh came from the freshly executed. Tyburn gallows were not only a theater of death, they were a harvest ground. Physicians stood in the crowd, waiting with pursed lips and sharp eyes for the rope to snap a neck. Once the body swung limp, it was rushed away, not to burial, but to the butcher's table. The skull was sawn open, the warm blood caught in a pewter dish, to be sold on the spot to those who believed it would cure epilepsy. Still steaming, it was swallowed in the crowd, the way a man might drink a shot of brandy. In Germany and the Low Countries, the fat of the hanged became an ointment sold in the open. It was spread on wounds, rubbed into the skin for aches, or kept in a jar on the mantle like a talisman. Mothers anointed their sick children with it, murmuring prayers as though blending the flesh of the dead with the blessings of the divine. The irony was not lost on the clergy, but rather than banish the practice, some priests blessed the jars. After all, the body was God's vessel. What was healing if not an extension of the sacraments? Markets developed a language of their own for the trade. Mumia vera, for the imported ancient Egyptian corpse, dark and resinous. Mumia domestica, for the local dead, paler, fresher, often from criminals whose lives were deemed forfeit. There were whispers of even fresher goods: the bodies of the poor, sold by desperate families, the unclaimed dead, taken from infirmaries at night. This was not just medicine, it was commerce, and commerce was rarely sentimental. By now, the line between devotion and hunger blurred.
The act of consuming human remains began to carry an almost religious fervor. It was framed as a kind of communion. You take in the essence of another, and in doing so, you are made whole. But unlike the holy wafer, this communion was not symbolic. It was literal, fibrous, iron-rich. The taste was copper and dust, masked with wine or honey. The sensation was the same for a king in Versailles and a beggar in Amsterdam, the swallowing of death to keep death away. And in this way, the practice became part of the rhythm of life. It was not shocking anymore. It was not even whispered. It was a fixture, like bread, like salt, like prayer. The dead fed the living, and the living walked on, comforted by the thought that when their time came, they too might live on, not in memory, but in the veins and marrow of another.
By the mid-18th century, the taste for human remedies began to sour, not because of morality, but because of science. The Enlightenment brought new questions, and new men eager to wield reason like a blade. Physicians began publishing papers denouncing mumia as fraud, claiming it cured nothing but superstition. The more skeptical accused apothecaries of mixing in donkey flesh, shoe leather, or even clay to stretch their supply. The magic, it seemed, was not immune to the poison of doubt. In Paris, Louis XV's court still whispered of powdered skull for epilepsy, but the whispers were half apology. In England, the College of Physicians publicly declared the practice unseemly, though behind closed doors, a few members kept their own hidden stores. In the German states, the gallows harvest slowed not from any law, but because the crowds now came less for the blood and more for the spectacle. Death was still entertainment, but the meal afterward had lost its flavor. And yet, the practice did not vanish overnight. In rural markets of Ireland, in the alleys of Prague, and in the dark corners of Italian apothecaries, you could still find jars labeled in fine script, Mumia Vera. Some claimed it was for nostalgia, others for tradition. For the poorest, it was not even about belief, it was about cost. A spoonful of powdered bone was cheaper than a physician's visit, and a good story about Egyptian magic could be as healing as the finest tonic. The real shift came when the human body itself became a battlefield for another industry, anatomy. With the rise of medical schools, corpses were no longer ground into medicine, but dissected for knowledge. The same bodies that once became bread for the sick were now laid open under candlelight for students to map the mysteries of veins, nerves, and bone. Death had not been humanized, only repurposed. The intimacy of eating the dead was replaced by the cold precision of learning from them. For the first time in centuries, the dead were left uneaten, but the idea that human flesh could give life lingered in the bloodstream of culture. It survived in whispers, in stories, in the stubborn belief that what is strongest in another can be taken into oneself. The hunger never truly died, it merely found new ways to feed itself. Today, the thought of a king sipping human blood or a merchant selling ground skull in a jar seems obscene. We like to believe we are cleaner, wiser, more civilized than those who came before. And yet, walk into a modern pharmacy and see the bottles labeled collagen taken from animals, sometimes humans. Read of experimental transfusions, stem cell therapies, and organ transplants. Listen to the advertisements that promise you can drink something, take something, swallow something, and live longer. The language has changed. The ritual has changed. But the old hunger? It is the same. We still want to steal life from another body. We still want to swallow what we cannot create. The royals who once feasted on flesh would find our habits quaint but familiar. They would recognize in us the same bargaining with mortality, the same refusal to accept that we are made of dust. Perhaps the most disturbing truth is this: when they swallowed the dead, they were not simply being barbaric, they were being human. Human in the most desperate, unvarnished sense. And when we recoil at their feasts, we are not recoiling at their strangeness, but at the reflection of our own hunger, staring back across the centuries. In the end, the communion never ended. It only changed its recipe.